Good morning, everybody. My name is Sharon Lashley. I am the MD of Climate Action North, and I run a community interest company social enterprise with my colleagues, Jennifer Claire Robson and Julie Harrison, both who are in the audience today. We were set up to take action on climate change, so we run a number of projects to mitigate the effects of climate change. It could be anything from our new pollinator parks initiative, planting projects in business parks and rewilding business parks, to litter picks and beach cleans, education projects for communities and schools. And we work a lot with businesses as well. So part of our main audience is actually working with big businesses, and that's where we get a lot of our funding from. We are funded by corporate social responsibility money from businesses, which is quite good really, because businesses do need to give something back to communities and take action on climate change. So today we're running this webinar for World Environment Day. Since we started in 2017, we've always had a World Environment Day event in some form, because it's important that we celebrate the United Nations Environment Programme, and this year's theme is about biodiversity, time for nature. So time for nature, big subject, lots of ways that we spend time in nature and can be interpreted by different people in different ways. Morning, Sacha.
Good morning.
Good morning. We are, basically I know Sacha and have known her for quite a long time. Sacha was actually one of the speakers at our last year's World Environment Day event. So if anyone was there, they will remember Sacha setting an amazing example for climate change and actually cycling something like 300 miles, Sacha, was it, to get to Newcastle or Gateshead. She cycled a long way. She made a point of saying, you know, this is a climate change event, so let's do it by cycling all the way from Devon to Gateshead, which is where we held our event, which was an amazing
and can I say one of the most amazing things also was a chance to talk to people who aren't already kind of people in my sphere, to talk to ordinary people on the ground when they're saying, God, why are you cycling to Newcastle? I could say why, and it was interesting to hear ordinary people's kind of views on the climate.
Yeah, and I mean, that was your journey, wasn't it? Part of your journey was to record what people were saying and have a chat with them. And it was an amazing feat. So we were thankful for that, because you brought our carbon footprint right down for that event. It was really good. It was really good. So basically, we worked together as well, just briefly. I worked with Sacha as a volunteer for one of her projects, Flight of the Osprey, and I might ask her a few questions about things later. So the format for this particular talk with Sacha is about, you know, Sacha will give an overview of certain things, and then we'll have kind of an interview, I suppose. There will be questions, obviously, from the attendees, and I might have a few questions, and so might the panelists as well. So that's kind of the format for Sacha's talk this morning. So I will stop talking and hand over to Sacha. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Am I not going to? Okay. So I will see if we can now get everything going. Right, where can I start off? So I have got some slides here, and as Sharon has mentioned, I am going to just give, I suppose, a brief introduction. She kind of asked for a bit of a personal angle on our background in nature and what kind of drove us to be interested in nature and a particular moment. So I kind of spent a long time thinking about this, because I think for me, my childhood was very much kind of within nature. I grew up in Australia. In fact, let me just quickly flip to our slides while I can still do that. Let me just check this. Sorry about this. Share screen. PowerPoint. Sharing screen. Right, can people see that? Can I get some sort of confirmation that that can be seen? All good? Right, I can see there's messages coming up, but I can't see what they are. Yep, okay, fine, fabulous. Right, so yeah, let me just go back again. So yeah, I am, as Sharon mentioned before, I spoke last time round about Flight of the Swans, and that is what I'm known as, the human swan to a lot of people. But that's not what I am going to talk about today. I'm just going to go right to the background, because what most people don't realize is that I actually, before joining WWT and getting involved with the Flight of the Swans expedition, I actually was really not a bird expert. My whole background was in the water. And so I'm going to quickly go to that. So I grew up on the northern beaches of Sydney, and on the northern beaches of Sydney. Gosh, this is really quite unusual. I grew up on the northern beaches of Sydney. That is me on the left-hand side, very much a kid who absolutely loved the beach. The northern beaches of Sydney, they're a beautiful part of the world to grow up in. And there's me with my dad on the right-hand side. And I mentioned, I show that slide in particular because I spent a lot of my childhood out at the beach with him, either in the surf or out while he was spearfishing. He would basically go spearfishing off the rocks. So you can see a rocky headland in the picture. And I would just be left to sit on the rocks and explore the rock pools. And so for me, kind of being out in nature and actually being left to be quite to look after myself in nature to some extent was part of normal for me, which I know is very not normal for a lot of kids these days. But I show this slide in particularly my dad because there was a moment that I remember that with my dad, which was potentially one of the things that diverted me to a life of adventure and conservation, and combining the two of them, and maybe why I kind of feel confident in nature. And that moment was being in the surf with my dad. Basically, he used to stick me on his surfboard and we would basically ride waves in. Obviously, I was a really tiny child at this time, but there was a moment where in my memory, we were riding along, I was on the front of the board and Dad pushed me off the front. And he pushed me off the front of the wave, as I remember it, and I basically ended up in quite a big dumper. This was a big wave that he was actually surfing, not just sitting on. And I ended up being underwater, being tumbled around and around and around. I was in this horrible surf and I was kind of panicking. And then I stopped for a moment. I remember thinking, why am I panicking? This kind of surf the wave is going right into the shore. And if I just relax, I'm going to be calmer and it's going to eventually take me to somewhere near the shore. And I was tumbled around quite a lot and I ended up coming up. And I was obviously quite, I was fine. My hair was completely matted with sand, but I was fine. And that was definitely a moment for me of thinking that actually, it was a moment of thinking that you could actually working with nature and not fighting it might be a good approach. And basically for the rest of my life, I obviously spent a lot of time in the water, in the sea, and was generally, I suppose respectful of the power of nature, but also that by working with it is often the way to go. So I suppose that generally sets up lots of different parts of the future direction that I ended up taking. So yeah, this childhood in the northern beaches of Sydney. Also, am I going to go to the next slide? No. Was the reason why, why I ended up becoming a freediver. So freediving has been a passion of mine. Basically, when I was a child, I kind of knew that I could hold my breath for a very long time. And I ended up in 1990, I can't remember quite what, becoming a freediver. I was at university in London and ended up being I was in university in London. I ended up on Trafalgar Square at one point and nearly sort of pushing over somebody accidentally as I was trying to take a photograph, and out of their bag spilled lots of different photographs of freediving. And I just remember seeing those pictures and going, oh my God, that's something that I could do. And I went on called up the guy and I said to him, could you freedive the James Egan Lane, this amazing ship in Plymouth Harbour? Could you freedive that? And he said, well, if you can hold your breath for 3 minutes, you could freedive it. And I went home and I did 3 minutes 15, I think, on the sofa, and that was it. By that, I was hooked, and it was only, I think, 5 weeks later, I was on the British team, and that is me on the right hand side, competing at the first World Championships. at my first turn of World Championships for the UK team. But that was, I suppose, that was my kind of start of, well, how can I skip to this? The next phase I think I wanted to look at was kind of back in Sydney, looking at all the different issues that were around the environment and conservation. And I started, obviously was out in the water quite a lot, looking at different issues. And one of the issues I started looking at the time, so I was out seeing things like the shark net issue. And this is obviously some photographs from that. And I had also an interesting realization during this time that whilst by that time I was actually a biologist, as a biologist, people were kind of interested to a certain level in what I had to say about marine conservation, but there was definitely a limit to it. And then I realized as soon as I became a champion freediver, suddenly they were a lot more interested. So there was definitely something really interesting there around different, how you get people inspired by conservation. And I also had a moment coming back from all those freediving competitions and going out and looking at the shark nets. Sorry if these images are kind of depressing for some people, but one of the other things that I noticed was that actually images to a lot of people, this image of, say, a shark caught up in a shark net, for a lot of people didn't really have a huge amount of impact for them. It basically looked like it's kind of images that people see of of people catching fish, and they were often there are pictures of sharks. So the shark nets were catching all kinds of things. They were catching obviously sometimes dolphins, they catch big fish, they catch sharks. Very few of them are actually dangerous sharks. Even the one at the bottom in the middle isn't particularly dangerous. But yeah, as a biologist trying to talk rationally about shark nets and do they make sense, which they didn't seem to me. People weren't that interested, but as soon as I became a freediver talking about it, they were really interested. And I'll kind of divert for a moment to tell you a story about with my dad. I had also, now that I was good at freediving, I had started to spearfish. So I always really liked the idea of, if I was going to eat fish, going out and catching my own fish. And so as a really good free diver, you have a lot of time, you're very comfortable in the water, you can be very selective about what you shoot. And I remember thinking that was great. And I remembered, the time with my dad as a child, looking at going out while he was spearfishing. I remember the day going back to him in Sydney and telling him that I'd bought my first spear gun and that I was going out spearfishing. And I just remember I was hoping that he would look at me in kind of excitement about girl kind of following in his footsteps. And he looked at me in horror and was just like, oh no, like, do you have any idea what the difference in sea when you were a child? So we're talking kind of late 70s, early 80s, that I was sitting on the rock pools with my dad. And he just said, well, we had always talked about, the waters off Sydney being pristine, and we'd use all kinds of like really quite nice language about it. And it does look pretty impressive from the air and things and underwater. And he just said, like, what he remembers from the late 70s was nothing like what we have these days. And he described that, diving off, he brought out a couple of spearfishing magazines, and on the front cover from the late 70s, you'd see pictures of someone off Sydney with like a string of fish that looked like they'd been up on the Great Barrier Reef. There was fish that I'd never seen off Sydney before. And I remember looking at it and going, gosh, how on earth would I know? Kind of, I talk about this as being pristine, but that was my first example of the kind of the shock of the shifting baselines, if you want to call it that, of just what people forget over time. And so, yeah, so that was definitely a moment that made me think, gosh, we need to kind of really look at the big picture, and I guess that's going to set the destination for the rest of my life. But the next shot I'm going to show is one that I have never ever shown in public before. It started from this whole issue of people not really responding to shots of dead sharks and things in nets, even if there was a population level problem. And so I had a chat at the time, and I met an artist. So this was another time of looking at how can creativity and alternative views make you, approach things in a slightly different way? So this artist had come to me, he was an underwater photographer, and he said, oh, look, I'd really like to take some shots of naked, of you freediving, but ideally they would be naked because, you know, that's much more artistic and beautiful. And I kind of dismissed him and thought, that's a ridiculous idea. Why on earth would I do that? And he kind of came back again a couple of times, and I just thought, no, look, I don't have any interest in that, or in particularly promoting the sport of freediving, which is what he was saying. You know, he said, what are you interested in? And I said, well, the shark nets. And he lived also on Sydney, on the coast, and he at that point swam out to the shark nets, and he actually had a look at what they are, and often they're like a tiny little strip of net. We might get a beach, for example, that is a few kilometres long off Sydney, and you might have two little strips of shark net at either end that sit a few metres off the bottom and a metre or so below the surface. They're kind of floating out there. And they certainly aren't an exclusion, which is what people think, but they do pretty randomly trap whatever happens to swim into them. Anyway, he swam out and saw those and came back and was like, oh my God, I had no idea that was what it was. This is outrageous and it's kind of ridiculous. It doesn't make any sense. Let's do something around that. And he eventually convinced me to do similar. So we basically we got a load of images from people called Ron and Valerie Taylor, who I'll show you in a minute, that they had taken over many years in many different places. They were in their 70s at the time, of animals caught in shark nets. And so we thought we'd replicate them with people, because maybe that would work. And because clothing would be distracting, he did manage to convince myself and two other friends that we would try this, that we would put this exhibition together. So I found myself somehow, I don't know how, swimming out to shark nets, and yeah, we did a load of pictures mimicking things, and obviously I have a really good breath hold, so I'm getting actually tangled up in shark nets with a couple of safety divers there, and we made a series of images, and they were quite beautiful, and they were not particularly graphic, but they were pretty impressive. But looking at them all in one, I just thought that there's no way, I cannot show these. Like this is you know, complete exposure, gratuitous potentially. What is this about? And so I sat on them for a year and was like, no, we can't release them. And then eventually I got a call from someone from the Australian Conservation Foundation and the main aquarium in Sydney. And together they were saying, we really, really need to get people talking about the shark nets. And we've heard that these images exist, you know, can we please use them? And so they eventually convinced me to, me and the other girls, to release them. And so here's just one of the images from it. There were a whole series, some of them more I suppose shocking, not in the human body kind of shocking, but certainly in the visual of it. And believe it or not, they were shown at, in the aquarium, they were shown in the news, and it basically started all the conversation about sharknet again. And to be honest, these days, with what I've learned, I'd probably handle a lot of the campaign stuff a bit differently. However, it got people talking, and it certainly kind of made me give up a load of the, I suppose I was maybe learned from that, to take risks, that there are, like, if you believe, well, if I kind of believe enough in the cause, then what have I really got to lose with doing, obviously in future there were very different kinds. But yeah, that was the shark net. So back to Ron and Valerie Taylor. These are the couple who, some of you may know them, they're quite big characters in Australia, or Ron is now dead. But they filmed the underwater sequences of Jaws, and after Jaws came out, they then spent years touring America trying to tell people to stop going out and shooting sharks or spearing sharks. That lots of the stuff that they were in the film wasn't right, that they used a midget in some of the shots so that the shark looked enormous. And these two were really quite influential and had given, yeah, obviously their photos for the previous exhibition. But they also had another really powerful moment with Ron, who was, you know, significantly older than my father again. I found myself at their house in Sydney, and they'd made a lot of underwater films, and he took me up to his edit suite, and he had a big old edit suite, like from the days where you would cut tape. And we basically went back there, up to his edit suite, and he was talking about all the footage and saying, God, what's the use of this anymore? What's the use of this anymore? It doesn't really look like, I mean, no one would recognize this as being Sydney anymore. And so I was like, what do you mean? And he showed me some of the footage, and he just said, I might as well throw it away, because it honestly looked like a fish soup. He said, this is what it used to be off Sydney a couple of decades even before my father was there. This is what it used to look like. And again, it was another case of shifting baselines, being, do we really keep on forgetting what we've lost, and how do we keep reminding ourselves of that? So yeah, Ron and Valerie were really big characters in my life. And so from obviously a childhood, I suppose, with people doing adventures, kind of learning to take risks, I ended up somehow at WWT working with scientists. I suppose that's what I tended to get really excited about, working with scientists who had you know, a really important story to tell, and also trying to turn them around. So yeah, I ended up at WWT and being surrounded by people, scientists looking at the migrating swans and all the different challenges for them. And it again seemed like, you know, it was big. There were lots of different issues. It was quite overwhelming. They were writing letters trying to get people to come to meetings and talk about what could be done to try and to get those people to meetings, what could be done to make them motivated. It was very easy for Poland to say, well, why should we do our piece if all the other countries along the flyway from Russia to the UK, if they weren't all going to do their bit? And so yeah, that's where I came up with the idea of Flight of the Swans. And so I know many of you here will have seen my talk last year, but as a quick summary, the kind of concept firstly was, well, I kind of thought, I grew up in hunting, or various hunting communities in Australia as well. As an example, people are, whether it's kind of people in hunting or industry or whatever, if you pitch at them with too negative a story, like lots of birds dying and you're part of the cause, they're unlikely to listen. But if you come up with an alternative story, like, for example, freediving champion showing people the shark nets, if you come up with an alternative way of telling the story that makes them go, what, and grabs their attention first and maybe inspires a little bit of awe, then maybe you end up with the right kind of frame of mind to speak to them. So I had thought, well, the most awesome thing about the swans is the fact that they do these incredible journeys, and I don't know many people that actually would know that. And so yeah, I put together this idea of flying with the birds. Originally we talked about putting little cameras on them and decided that was impractical. I would fly with the birds, basically being their voice for them, filming them, photographing them. That would get kind of media coverage, but I could also then go and talk to all the people along the flyway. And that's where I kind of really started to learn the kind of the science behind what I kind of felt was there anyway. That when you kind of start off with, there's a problem, you're part of it, you need to fix it, you instantly get people's defenses up. Whereas if you turn up as a person flying something, manage to inspire a bit of awe and wonder to start with, then you get people in a very different frame of mind where they're much happier. I think the science is that their amygdala starts working, which is the part of you which makes you feel more creative. It makes you feel kind of quite small and insignificant, but also more collaborative. And that's potentially the trigger for making lots of people act. So yeah, so basically I ended up putting together this expedition, which was Flight of the Swans. And if it's possible, I will just show you the video now. Let's just see if this works for you. Sharon, can you tell me if it's jolting?
The bird actually being shot.
Could be the end of that nest.
Okay. Can you all hear me over the top of that? I think you can. Yeah, so that expedition, I mean, it was a success, got large. When do you want to stop questions? Okay, love it. There is, yeah, there was, on that expedition, there were a few, yeah, it was a success. We managed to get huge amounts of coverage, spoke to lots of communities along the flyway. It looks like potentially the decline in swans might have stopped. We've got lots of activities happening along the flyway. Up in Russia, where we're trying to work for a long time dealing with people. We now have about 20 people in the Swan Champion Network. It includes all the Russian tourism hunters, for example, the people involved in tourism, engaged in it and saying, and Nanette's groups as well. And there were a few moments on the expedition, though, that were particularly, I suppose, highlight messages for me that are really important about how we go forward in this this new world and this, certainly the decade of supernature. So those few moments, there was one moment in which I was speaking to a Nanette's group. So the Nanettes are the people that live up in the Arctic and nomadic. And I remember saying to them, what would you say to people who don't believe in climate change? And they kind of looked a bit and then ended up sort of rolling around in laughter and saying, you're supposed to be the kind of educated people, the wealthy educated people. How on earth could you think that? Because for them, it's so very real. And it covers, for me, it was a moment of going, oh, why? I'm going to stop engaging in those conversations anymore about whether it's real and just be really big and bold, because people like this are kind of suffering from it. There was also a moment where one of them, I talked about, you know, us looking at data of swan decline over many years, and since I think the 80s, we've known that 1 in 3 birds has got shot in their bodies. So lots of them are being shot along the flyway. And one of them just said to me, why hasn't anyone spoken to us about this before then? And I thought, well, I think scientists and people probably think they have been, but clearly not, and certainly not in a way that is this kind of this real and open and one-to-one. So more of that, more of kind of opening up to people, less of conservationists, I suppose, trying to have everything under control. I just want to be really open and just kind of say, conservationists haven't got it covered and we can't have it covered. It's kind of up to everybody, but we need to be a bit more open about that, and I suppose share the stories. And a big part of that expedition was not about saying, all these things are wrong, you're doing this bit, what can you do about it? I very much opened it with a kind of idea of what could be going wrong with the swan, so we could engage people's kind of brains and creativity into wondering about that as well, and maybe figuring out for themselves what they could be doing. And yeah, so, and there was another couple of moments, I suppose, afterwards about Western approaches to things. So I remember giving a presentation. Should I show another slide? Maybe I can move to the next slide. I remember giving a presentation to a group of executives in which I showed a couple of slides of flying over the Arctic tundra. And a couple of ladies at the end kind of went to me, God, that must have been so awful. And then loads of other people in the room were like, yeah, it must have been so awful. And I was like, wow, could you really think, like, flying over the Arctic tundra, the biggest open kind of wild wetland in the world, like home to breeding waterbirds from 5 of the 8 major flyways around the world. Do you really think that is awful? Like, for me, it was heavenly, but it just reminded me that you have to keep remembering that other people's kind of, I suppose their baseline of what is a normal interaction with nature, what that's like. So that's potentially a big barrier where I can talk about, you know, yes, of course we want nature. Well, there are people there that seem to still not. So trying to get inside their heads a bit more. And there was also a moment where I spoke to a load of students, and one of the girls said, you know, that was fantastic, but I could never do anything like that, and walked off. And I just thought, oh, that's really not the message I want to be giving out. I want to be giving out a message of whatever you can do is, whatever your skills are, if you can use them, then that could potentially have a real big difference. So I definitely have tried to shift away from that. So yeah, that is why Conservation Without Borders was born. There was another moment, I suppose, where I spoke, in South Africa to a UN body which has scientists and conservation groups, but also representatives, the hunting communities and others, in tears about it and saying, God, you found a way of kind of bringing people together all along a flyway. We need more of that. So at that, I was kind of waved a red flag, and I thought, oh gosh, there was so much effort in Flight of the Swans. But if it really works and we need it, then let's do more of that. So I put together Conservation Without Borders to do more expeditions, have managed to recruit amazing volunteers to help out on that, which is great. And yeah, focusing largely on migratory species. So yeah, there we have it. Excuse me for a second. So yeah, Flight of the Osprey is a journey from Scotland down to Ghana in West Africa. It covers some amazing territory, and yeah, it's through the eyes of the Osprey. And the Osprey makes a perfect vehicle to talk about all the different issues we face in nature, of climate, of biodiversity, of, you know, changing weather systems. But I looked at it and I thought, well, people aren't maybe ready for talking about all those issues to start up. Let's just talk about, you know, following the Osprey. 6 of 10 birds who leave as juvenile birds don't return. So clearly there's things going on along the flyway. So yeah, that's it. So we set up Flight of the Osprey, recruited some amazing people to help out with that. And I was busy working on that and planning that last year, recruiting people, etc. And then I found myself, sorry, this is the expedition route, if I hadn't made that clear before. And then I found myself at Christmas last year, back home in Australia. So this is where my mum lives, in the southeast corner of Australia. We took in various animals, as I was a child, wild animals that people would bring in. This was a wombat called Obelisk that was brought in as a really, really tiny thing. In fact, our dog had actually found that one, but others and wallabies were brought in at times. I'll just see if I can play for you. This is a recording my mum had taken not very long ago of kind of the standard soundscape at home. So that's looking from the balcony out. So you can see why I said I kind of had a childhood where nature was kind of very much part of the inside as well. And yeah, so this is where I found myself at Christmas. Maybe stop sharing screen so we can see that. Sharon, sorry, if you need to stop sharing screen, let me know. So yeah, you can hear completely surrounded by nature. And we used to have wedge-tailed eagles hunting my little sister's guinea pigs, actually, unfortunately, from the trees, kookaburras hunting from out the front. Absolutely beautiful. And when I was out there as a child, we basically had the freedom to roam. There's a big river in front of the house. We could spend a lot of time out there. And then there were fires going on at the time. You will have seen this photograph before in the news, I'm sure. So I found myself at Christmas at Mum's, and we were, I was with her. My mum's been in the Rural Fire Brigade out there in this part of Australia for years. And we knew that there was a fire risk. There had been a drought for some time. So I was with Mum, as was my sister and a brother. And we spent time making sure that we pumped 120,000 litres into 3 enormous tanks out the back of at the back of our house, so that if the fire did come, that we could fight it. Where am I at? So yeah, so this was what we were faced. However, bushfires is reasonably, you know, it's not an uncommon thing in Australia, so we were getting prepared for it. And then as we watched kind of day by day reports of what the fires were actually like, there was talk of pyrocumulonimbus, and I'd never heard the term before. But being a pilot interested in clouds, like I started looking at this and thinking, gosh, this isn't like anything I think that we have seen before. And I'm not sure that that Mum was quite realizing that either. And again, this is the kind of picture. So there was fires so big they were creating their own storms, very terrifying things, up to I think 12 kilometers high. They were being reported not far from Mum's. And so we were still looking at that and thinking, God, really, can we and hoses actually fight this fire? And yeah, a couple of days later, we find ourselves looking at a map like this. So this is the prediction, and I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but this is where my mum's place is, and it's just inland from Eden. And yeah, so we found ourselves looking at that and managed to convince Mum that there was no way that we could fight this with fires and everything. And thankfully the head of the local fire brigade also said, you know, this is, to my mum Ursula, this is not like anything that we have seen before, and just don't be there, don't be there. And so Mum agreed to evacuate into Eden, and we had a then kind of hair-raising moment of basically kind of watching the news. I wasn't there anymore, but she was then evacuated again out of that as the fires got closer and closer. And yeah, we had, I think, 4 days of just not knowing. That obviously stopped flying anything overhead because of the weather and the storms and everything were too bad. We had about 4 days of wondering what had happened to the house. And then eventually I managed to get a Facebook message from a friend of ours who lives across the river. So down the hill, across the river and up the other side. And I sent him a message and said, is there any chance our house has survived? And he said, I saw the fire come over the back of your hill and like a wall of lava. And I just thought, oh my God, how am I going to fight this? And he said, within seconds, although it's an hour's walk away, you couldn't see our actual house from there. It's an hour's walk away. As soon as I saw it appear, fires started igniting all around him. And he basically, rather than stand and fight, he'd soaked his house and cleared all the trees for about 100 meters around. He just drove his truck down into the river and hid in a pool in the river, the deepest one he could find, under a log with a wet blanket over him, shaking and eventually shivering for about an hour, he reckons, because he was shivering by the end. And eventually, yeah, ran up and managed to put out the fires that were on his house. But he did say ours was very little chance of it actually surviving. And yeah, that's about what we have left of our place. It's yeah, it's absolutely nothing apart from the chimney, and all the outbuildings are gone as well. Obviously, this is reasonably terrifying for Mum. She is now living in a well, I suppose the key thing from this is it's a big part of my childhood that has kind of gone up in smoke. And so this COVID time has been a moment for me of thinking, God, what do I actually take from this? Obviously, I've been working in conservation for quite a long time, talking about climate change for quite a long time. What can one do with an experience like this? And, you know, are you broken? There's 20 other houses all along our stretch of the river. There's a 40-kilometre fire front. And they're all completely gone. So there's lots of other people in a similar situation. But yeah, what can you really make of it? And I decided, I think the message I can take from that, inspired, you know, partly by Mum, who's managed to find some joy in the fact that, I'm not sure if you can see on the mantelpiece, that there's a piece of metal there, and that is the front left wheel of a vehicle that was parked next to the house. And the fact that it looks a little bit like a ghost from Ghostbusters. And she's found on the right-hand side, there's a few bits of pottery that survived. Anything that was any precious metal has vanished, but bits of the pottery survived and didn't have the glaze burnt off. But she's managed to kind of take some small joy in pieces like that. And I suppose what it's done for me is look at climate change in that part of Australia would never have been talked about by the local people at the pub. It just would not have. If someone started talking about it, everyone probably would have turned away. It has become, or certainly had become at the time, pretty normal conversation. Definitely normalised it, and the fact that the chief of the fire police, who's well respected character, will talk about that quite openly now. And the fact that this is not like anything we've had before. So that, I suppose, is reassuring. Mum says the community spirit in the village has never been so good, and it's still good. Like, we're talking 4 months on, 5 months on now. Community spirit is still really strong. People are still banding together. The caravan that was donated to her to live in came filled with lots of handmade stuff and donations of things from people, and people just talk to each other on the street. They constantly ask each other how they are. There's a lot of volunteering going on. So she says community spirit doesn't look like it's dying anymore. So perhaps that is a good omen for what might come post-COVID for the rest of us. Maybe this community spirit really doesn't die after you've had a shock like this. But the other thing it did was make me think that basically, how can anything be big enough? How can anything I do in conservation really feel big enough? And this is what it looks like now. You can see that part of Australia is still the grass trees and things are coming back, but as far as you can see on all those hills, it's still burnt. And the only insects that Mum can find anywhere are mosquitoes. So everything really got a hammering there. So yeah, how can anything really feel big enough? Obviously, Flight of the Osprey, I've come back to that, and it is important, but I had avoided talking about the really big issues, because were people ready for it? Of course, it is about climate change. It is about the biodiversity connection to climate change. Why is ripping up so much of our biodiversity really so important for our climate? So you can't do Flight of the Osprey without also talking deforestation and talking extreme overfishing and many other issues. They're just a couple of them. Maybe the world is now ready for us to just openly talk about it, and think really big. Stop thinking, oh, people can't handle this, and actually just aim big. So that's kind of where I've got to at the moment. So Flight of the Osprey, I've actually kind of come out and been honest that it's actually part of a big global program to travel lots of migratory routes all around the world in different parts. So he's just I haven't made it into something beautiful yet, but the reality is it is about the next 10 years. It is about looking at those crazy targets of, can we turn around things for the climate and biodiversity in 10 years? Those targets are really real, and most people don't realize it. So yeah, coming out and pitching those all as a package that could have a really kind of significant impact, both on getting people engaged, on showing people the reality. Because on an expedition, you basically tell all the different big scary stories, but through human interactions with people, stopping and showing them exactly what problems are, what they actually look like. What does our over extraction of water for the vegetables we're using in the UK, what does it look like for the people that live around a place in Senegal, for example? What is our chocolate, the cocoa from our chocolate, what does that look like in terms of biodiversity loss in Cote d'Ivoire? But alongside all of those stories, we can meet people that are doing stuff to change that around. So we can do it in a way that is quite inspiring. And yeah, so that's the one level of thinking quite big. And the other is becoming a creative agents for nature. So this is a new initiative that is basically trying to work with the advertising world, who have been excellent at influencing people, influencing markets, influencing what we buy, how we buy it, what we think. And if we can divert all of that power and some of the budgets they're responsible on behalf of many corporates, match those to real scientific things from the IPBES reports and various other UN things. If we can match those two together and try and divert those efforts towards the biodiversity targets and see if we can really turn stuff around in 10 years, then I feel like we have half a chance. I did have as well, just I'll end on this, one really kind of shocking moment with one person in the advertising industry who I'd been talking about it with, who called me up after our meeting and said, "So did you make that stuff up about the 10 years to turn stuff around for biodiversity?" And I was like kind of silent on the phone thinking, if you've really not heard that before, then we definitely, like, this partnership with the ad industry is more important than ever. So yeah, that's where I'm at the moment. Sharon, so I hope that I'm okay for time.
You're fine. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you
yeah,
fine.
I think we should maybe, if you've got a couple of questions, Sacha, if you're okay to answer some questions.
Yes,
yeah. Mandy asked a question about, just bear with me. She said, "It was great to meet you last year." Mandy was at the conference last year, and to hear about, you know, what you've achieved today. The question is, with your knowledge on how to gain a positive reaction from so many people using alternative methods, how do you think we can use the positive effects from the current lockdown to persuade people to continue taking a step back and allowing nature to thrive? Do you think there are any lessons learned from the lockdown from that perspective?
From all of that, well, I mean, yeah, as in, I mean, kind of what I said, reminding people of that. I think we might find that community spirit is really strong. There is one particular thing I've noticed from expeditions, is that there's kind of one thing, finding things which grab people's attention, and that is really useful, which I suppose in an expedition context is like landing in a community and turning up, or the media coverage. That sort of things makes people go, "Oh my God, wow, what, why?" Asking all those questions. But the thing that I think really motivated people, and that goes for people on the tundra to people in you know, working on a farm here in Devon, people tend to be inspired to act by hearing that other people somewhere else are doing their bit. And the more you can tell those stories of lots of different people doing their bit, they can see how something local really can make a difference. And that's, I suppose, the thing that I'm really keen to do. And one thing that's really good about flyaway expeditions, whilst kind of following a bird seems potentially like it could be, you know, nice, but does it really have an impact? That's how it has an impact, because people see that lots of other people are going to do their thing. And yeah, if they do, then what I'm doing will add up to something important. We just have to keep telling that message, and we also need to hear it coming from the corporate world.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's real messages, isn't it? Real people doing real things. And I think if you can tell that story, then it's easier to get that message across. I've got one more question as well I'd like to ask. I know you recently became a UN ambassador for migratory species. I know that's like a fairly new role. I mean, what kind of work will you be looking forward to doing in that role? What kind of things have you got planned? Can you share them with us or not?
Well, I suppose I was given that role in recognition for the flight of the swans and for bringing people together along a flyway. So I will be doing, yeah, more of the same as I showed in that previous slide, putting together expeditions which are, which, you know, travel following migratory species, bring a lot of people together, but wherever possible, sharing the story broadly. So Flight of the Swans, we only really measured media coverage along the flyway, but we had lots of coverage in Africa. We had lots of coverage in Asia. So yeah, trying to get coverage that way, and working with the other two ambassadors for migratory species are really interesting characters. The Indian one is very different, you would think, to my background. He's a Bollywood star with huge coverage, but he did go to university in Ballarat in Australia, in outback Australia. So we have got a tiny bit in common. So working with him a bit. But yeah, and yeah, various other projects as comes up. But that's really my focus.
Excellent. And I've got one more as well. Obviously, you mentioned that the Flight of the Swans work is still ongoing. I think you're still doing a bit of work on, you know, are you still doing work across the flyways, or are you actually working with different countries on swans as well? Are you still doing stuff around that?
Yeah, we have now a really, like I said, really strong relationship with people in the Arctic. So there's ongoing work there. We're just re-editing a film. The film from the expedition is with a distributor, so you can only see it if the broadcaster has bought it. So that's a large amount of money, way more than countries along the flyway have got, the broadcasters have. So we are kind of remaking a film that can show a half-an-hour film showing all the kind of conservation benefits to that. But yeah, working along the flyway. So what we've basically done is get a load of people enthusiastic about it, get more collaboration going. There's more individuals who've realised that actually they can do their part of it. There's a lawyer in the Netherlands, for example, who's really active. So yeah, it inspired lots of people. And that was, I suppose, the key thing. When I gave my acceptance speech in India for the UN ambassador thing, I thought, God, there's so many people out there doing amazing things for birds. What I do is quite niche. How can I really use this title? And I thought the key thing I can do is try and inspire a lot more people to feel that they too can be an ambassador for migratory birds, that, you know, your voice does really count.
Excellent. I'm really excited about you taking that role as well. I think we've got a lot more to look forward to, I suppose, from you, keeping us up to date. If anyone else has any questions for Sacha at a later date that they might think of, then please do let us know, because we will be collecting the questions and sending some answers out. I've got one more question for you though, Sacha. Have you any calls to action? Because today is about time for nature and asking people to make a pledge to make some time for nature. Have you got any particular calls to action you want to share with us this morning?
Wow, any particular calls to action? Oh, can I save that for the end?
You can save it for the end, but you can say it now, and you can also, we'll write it down and send it out to everyone. So I
suppose the key thing for me is, I mean, it's not necessarily a call to action as much. I'll give you one at the end as well, but the main thing is to use whatever skills it is that you have, or whatever kind of influence you have if you're in the corporate world. But all of that is really needed now to inspire a load of people to change. So yeah, use your particular niche of skills and influence, and it will be useful.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Sacha. That was brilliant. I'm sure everyone would agree. And we will come back to you at the end of the talk as well and have a little chat at the very end. So you can go and have another cup of tea now, and you can put, if you could go on mute and stop your video, that would be fantastic. And we'll welcome Alan. If you can hear me, Alan. Good morning, Alan.
Good morning.
So Alan, we're just going to start with your talk as well. I'll just do a very little introduction, a very brief introduction for everybody. So Alan, you are an ecologist, nature photographer and inspirational public speaker, which I've watched a lot of your webinars, so I've sort of, you know, been quite inspired by everything that you've done. In 1986, you founded the award-winning Scottish conservation charity Trees for Life, and you were their executive director for almost 30 years. So it's quite an interesting story about Trees for Life, but which you might want to talk about at some point, but if you don't, then that's fine. So I'll just hand over to you. Thank you, Alan.
Okay, thanks, Sharon, and hi to everybody out there who's watching this webinar today. Hope you're finding it useful. It was great to hear Sacha's talk. And I'm going to approach the subject of time for nature on a very personal basis, tell you a bit about my experience, my story, and hopefully that will have some relevance for everybody. So time for nature is very important for me because over the years I've discovered that is really my source of inspiration. That's where I get my nourishment. It's where I find a sense of peace. It's where I get ideas, and it's where I feel at home. And I think that's really quite fundamental because a lot of people still live in the world today with a view that the world is a hostile place. You know, we've got to defend ourselves against it, and you know, there's dangerous animals and storms and climate change and all these things, and humans have to conquer nature. I've cultivated a very different attitude over the years because I am indigenous to planet Earth. I belong here. I'm part of the web of life. And I've come to that knowing by reclaiming what I would term part of my lost birthright. And I feel like, I say to people, I feel like I've grown up quite deprived in the world. And I'm quite provocative in saying that because I grew up in Scotland, which is a relatively wealthy country. My family weren't rich, but we weren't poor. We never lacked for anything. I got a good education. I have a healthy body. I hardly ever get sick. So on a physical level, I'm not deprived at all. But actually, I feel like I was deprived of one of my fundamental birthrights, which is daily contact with wild nature. daily contact with wild nature was the reality with which most of Homo sapiens, our species, lived for most of the 100,000 years or more that we've been on the planet. An immersion in wild nature, a recognition that we're part of the web of life, that we are connected to everything, that we affect nature and nature affects us. And I grew up in the absence of that, as probably most people do today. There's still some people in Borneo and remote parts of the Amazon and perhaps in the Kalahari in Africa who have that daily experience, but most of us don't. We grow up in towns and cities. We grow up surrounded by buildings and walls, artificial light, media, all those things which are human culture, but they separate us from nature. So part of my journey has been discovering, rediscovering that missing birthright, connecting with nature. And I consider myself quite fortunate because I grew up in a small town in Scotland, but when I was 8, my parents moved to a house out in the country a bit near Stirling, where it's now the University of Stirling, but there was a woodland behind my house, a little loch, and I got to play out in there. And I think that really cultivated something in me. And in my teenage years, we started traveling on summer holidays, going to the Mediterranean, places like that. And that enthused me to explore the world. So starting when I was about 18, 19, I began making trips out. And they very quickly became trips about journeys about exploring and discovering nature. Because I found when I went out into places like the Rocky Mountains in Canada when I was 19 for the first time, big mountains, large areas of forest, lakes, wildlife that wasn't afraid of people, it evoked a sense of awe and wonder in me. It gave me a sense of joy, a sense of inspiration, a sense of really being alive in this world and what a remarkable planet it is. And that helped me to grow as a person. It gave me the sense of, wow, I want to experience this. I want to immerse myself in this and feel what it's like to really be alive on planet Earth and see all the species and the habitats and the ecosystems. So I think many people go through this type of experience of awe and wonder in nature. It can be watching a sunset at the beach or climbing a mountain or walking in a forest or swimming in a lake or all that sort of thing. And nature gives a lot to people, gives a lot to me. When I'm out in nature, my time in nature is when I find a sense of peace. It's when I find a sense of centeredness, sense of coming home to myself. And I remember, for example, when I was a student at university, like many students, you know, I was in my late teens. I went when I was 17, quite an emotional time, lots of feelings and things, and part of that growing up process. And if I was feeling emotionally distraught, I would go for a walk around the campus of the university I was at, which was Essex University, which is one of those 60s universities with all the buildings together in one lump, but a big green campus with 3 lakes and bits of woodland. I would walk in the trees and around the lakes and find a sense of peace and stillness. I wasn't aware of what was happening at the time, but that was what occurred. But the significance of it only became apparent to me later, particularly when I began spending time out in real wild areas on the planet. And I'm fortunate I've had the opportunity to visit some of those places. For instance, in the mid-70s, I lived in the west of Canada for a while, and I worked as a surveyor, doing exploration work for mining companies, which I'm a bit embarrassed about now, working for the very things I don't like in the world, but it got me out into very remote places. And I spent one summer up in the Yukon in the north of Canada, where it was 24-hour daylight. I was with a few people in a camp, and we were supposed to, at the end of the survey, get a helicopter ride out to a lake and then a float plane back to civilization. And me and one of these other people I was working with decided we were not going to take the helicopter, we were going to walk out to the lake, which is like a 10-mile walk. And we had to do it overnight to make the schedule. At the end of the survey, we had one night of sleeping, but we decided not to sleep. So we did this hike, and we ended up climbing a mountain, 24-hour daylight, so no problem. And we sat on top of this mountain and watched kind of like the sunset at like midnight, and it became sunrise. We couldn't see the sun for 24 hours because of the mountains, but we got the colors. And when the sun reappeared from the behind the mountains at 2 in the morning, the first rays struck the mountains across the valley, covered in snow, and turned them pink. Those mountains, 100 miles in every direction there. No people, no roads, no houses, just wildness. And this dates me a bit, but this was in the mid-70s and long before the days of Ipods or even Walkmans, but I had a little portable cassette player with me, and listening to this music by Pink Floyd. Some listeners may know Wish You Were Here, and there's a song called Shine On You, Crazy Diamond. It's this long, grandiose build-up. And this music was playing as these first rays of sun hit the mountaintop. And it was like being at the birth of the world. It was like being at the dawn of creation. And I almost expected a volcano to erupt or dinosaurs to come striding down the valley, because it felt so other than human. And I had no words to describe what I was feeling at the time, but it felt awesome in the true nature of the world. Not just something that's casual awesome, but something that really evoked something very deep and primal in me. It felt like almost like I was the first person in that place. There were probably only a handful of people who had ever been there before, but I felt the presence of something in nature. It was almost slightly scary because it was unfamiliar, it was unhuman. It was a place where very few people had been before. And I felt the life force of the planet. I felt the spirit of Gaia, if you like. And that touched me deeply. And having had that experience, I find I need to keep going into beautiful, remote places, wild places, to feel that sense of home, to feel that deep connection with nature. And I can do it here too. Living in the north of Scotland, it's not very wild, but just a few miles away from me, we've got a little strip of coastline, sandstone cliffs with caves and rock arches, sea stacks, wonderful eroded rocks, and it's wild. And I was there yesterday for most of the day. I left here about 2 o'clock as the tide was going down, and I got home at 11 o'clock, and it was a wild day. The waves were crashing on the beach, the tide was coming in, there was a rainbow, I saw an otter. Birds were nesting on the cliffs, and it was just this breath of, I'm at home on planet Earth. This is my inspiration. This is my passion. So time for nature for me is about connecting deeply with nature, finding myself feeling at home on planet Earth. But crucially, over the years, it's shifted from just being what I would term this receptive experience of being out in nature and being touched, being inspired, enjoying the beauty, to recognizing that actually it needs to become a conscious two-way relationship. It needs to become a relationship in which not only do I receive something, but that I actually learn to give something back. And that really started for me when I came to live in the Findhorn community in 1978. I came here because I found a book about the Findhorn community that talked about people meditating with plants and connecting with what they term the consciousness of plants, getting messages, and the messages were all about the need for humans to change our relationship with nature, away from exploitation and domination to one of cooperation and to one of co-creation. Recognizing that nature, all species have a right to be here. They have an evolutionary journey that they are on, and they have a unique contribution to make to the wholeness and totality of life on Earth. And that as humans, we need to find a way to work creatively and positively with that, rather than imposing our own narrow objectives on it. So that began a journey for me of recognizing that I have something to give. We all have something to give. So my journey since the late 70s has been about, what can I give back to nature? What can I do to help repair the damage, to help maintain the beauty and diversity and richness of life on our planet? And that was what led me to found Trees for Life in 1986, as Sharon mentioned in the introduction. I spent a number of years visiting some of the remnants of the Caledonian forest in Scotland. The forest that used to cover most of the Highlands, but today is only scattered remnants, isolated from each other geographically, covering about 1% of the former range. One of the best of those is a place called Glen Affric, situated to the west of Loch Ness in the Highlands. And the first time I went there was a bit of a revelation in 1979, because it was a bit like going to a big forest I'd been to in Canada or in South America, and old trees covered in lichens and mosses, each with an individual character and shape different to all others, tumbling waterfalls on a river, lochs and mountains. For somebody who grew up in Scotland thinking that the bare hills and wide open green treeless landscapes were natural, it was a revelation. So I began going out there on a regular basis and developing a relationship with the place, getting to know it, understand it, connecting with it, building this relationship of reweaving myself into the web of life out there. And as I did that, I very quickly discovered that the forest was in very bad shape. It was only old trees. Most of them were dying of old age without being replaced. Nothing wrong with trees dying, that's natural, everything dies. But what was wrong was the absence of any new life to replace them. And that was because all the seedlings, they still produced good seed. The trees germinated, but they all got eaten by deer and sheep. Far too many large herbivores, totally out of balance. For 200 years, not a single tree had been able to grow, except for one area where a visionary forester in the 1960s had put up a fence to keep the deer out, and a whole new generation of trees had come back. Seeing this, I felt the forest was calling out for help. I could see that outside the fence it was all dying, and if nothing happened, those old trees in 50 years would be gone, no seed source, and it would become another desolate, treeless landscape like so much of the Highlands. And for several years I kept thinking, somebody should do something about this. Why isn't the Forestry Commission doing it? They own most of this land. Why isn't Scottish Natural Heritage, the Government Conservation Agency, doing something about this? That's their job. And it seemed to me, silently, with no words, the last trees were calling out for help. And eventually it sort of dawned on me, well, I see the problem. I feel this calling. Maybe I should do something about it. So that was what led me to start Trees for Life in 1986. And I made the commitment at the end of a week-long conference that I was the main organizer of, dedicated to the environmental crisis. One Earth, a call to action, it was called. And in the final session, we asked anybody who felt motivated to stand up in front of 300 people at the conference, make a commitment to do something positive for the planet. So my commitment was to launch this project. And at the time, I had no experience in forests or ecology. I had no training in biology. I had no access to land. I had no resources, no funds. On a physical level, I had nothing. But I had the most important thing. I had developed this relationship with nature. I had managed to connect deeply with that place. I felt myself embedded in the web of life and that I could do something. And I felt that if I really followed my heart and my calling, I could inspire people. And it was interesting to hear Sacha talk earlier about, inspiring people, because that's what we need in the world today. We need more inspiration. We need a sense of hope. And when anybody embodies their own inspiration, it's infectious. And that's what I found too. So Trees for Life grew from that idea, that commitment, and nothing on an external level. And today, the charity, has protected and planted millions of trees. It owns 10,000 acres of land. It's influenced projects in other parts of the world. Thousands of volunteers have taken part. And there's a whole new generation of trees supporting life in the Highlands because of it. And that came about because I made a commitment to follow my heart and to give something back to nature. And nature responds, people respond, and that is how I've been able to claim some of my power. So nature is my inspiration. Nature is my teacher as well. I have a degree in electronics that I never used, and all the things I do in my life now, whether it's work to restore a forest, photography, public speaking, writing, I have no training in. It's all come about because I've opened myself to my heart and my passion. I've opened myself to nature, and that has drawn forth those qualities. And yes, I take part in courses and I learn from books, talking to other people, from practical experience, but nature is at the heart of it all. It's about developing this relationship and giving something back. So what can we give back? And I think that's really important, because I think many people enjoy nature, but perhaps we don't all know what can we give back. And that's a unique circumstance for each one of us. It's finding our power, finding what is my passion, or what is your passion, and then acting on that, having the courage to step forward, to do something we've never done before, to take a risk, to step out, and as the quote that Sacha said there, to make the seemingly impossible inevitable. One of my favorite quotes is, evolution is the history of the impossible made possible. And it may seem impossible that we can change the world in this time of crisis and biodiversity, extinctions, and all the other problems that we face. But it's within our power if we each make a change, if we each make a commitment. And time for nature is crucial to that, because that is where the change has to be. We live in this human-dominated culture that's driven by economic growth and more of everything. And we all know, I think, in our bones and our hearts, there's no future in that. It has to change. And the starting point, I believe, is more time in nature. And time in nature is, for me, not just about going out on a nice day. I also like to go out on what I call John Muir days. John Muir, as many of you know, I'm sure, Scottish-born conservationist who founded the Sierra Club in the US, was influential in the protection of Yosemite and various other places, an author who wrote very deeply and passionately about the meaningful time he had in nature. And he's quite well known for the fact that he loved to be out in all elements. And one of his books, he describes how when he spent his first summer in the Sierra in California, a big storm came by, and whereas most people would rush for shelter, what did he do? He decided to climb the highest tree he knew, because he wanted to experience what's it like for a tree being in a storm. So I like to go out on John Muir days. I don't climb the highest tree necessarily, but I go out when it's raining, when it's windy, when there's a blizzard, and have those elemental experiences. I do it in a safe way. I'm not taking undue risks, but I want to experience those elemental encounters to feel truly alive. I do that in other ways too. I'm quite notorious here at Findhorn for organising a polar bear swim on the 1st of January every year. I've done it for 40 years, to immerse myself in the North Sea in the middle of winter. Pretty crazy, but it's exhilarating. It makes me feel alive. And of course, we've got a little minibus waiting to take us to a sauna afterwards to get warm again. So done safely, but it's that sort of powerful experience of deep connection with nature. And by doing that, and by taking conscious time out in nature, nature speaks to me. I believe nature speaks to all of us, but because we've grown up isolated and separated from this birthright, we've maybe forgotten how to understand the message that comes. And it's taking the time to be still, to be out in nature, to immerse fully, and for me to slow down and spend time. Then I get ideas, I get inspiration, I observe things. I notice things. Yesterday, out at the coast, I had this idea about photographing the birds that are nesting on the cliffs where I went. And there's a little rocky ledge at the top of one of the cliffs where I've been going to, where I can look down and see the cormorants with their chicks about 30 feet below. And I got there yesterday and I couldn't go onto the rocky ledge because some herring gulls had made their nest there, and there was an egg sitting there, and it was right where I would normally go, so I couldn't go there. So I had to change my plans. Walking back to where there's a rope ladder down a rock cleft to get onto the beach, I happened to notice a lot of ladybirds in the vegetation right beside the path. Now, well, that's interesting. What's going on? Why are there so many ladybirds? There were dozens and dozens of them. And because I know a bit about ladybirds, I thought they're probably there because they're aphids. And sure enough, I found aphids feeding on the grass, on the stems of grass, in amongst rust fungus. And I found ladybird eggs that had been laid there on the grass stems right next to the aphids, because the ladybird larvae will feed on the aphids. And I discovered this whole little world right there. I spent about half an hour just watching and observing this whole miniature ecosystem. And one or two other people were walking past along the way, and they were out with their dogs, and they were probably having a good time in nature. But nobody stopped to ask what I was doing, what I was seeing. So taking time to slow down to explore is really important for deepening that connection with nature, out of which my inspiration, my passion, my vision comes. So Trees for Life emerged from that. I've had a bigger idea for 20 years about the 21st century becoming known as the century of restoring the earth. And back in the late 90s, in 2000, 2001, I put some energy into trying to get the UN to declare the century of restoring the earth. Totally unsuccessful, but the idea seems to have taken root completely independently, because last year the government of El Salvador, nothing to do with me, but the government of El Salvador made the suggestion to the UN of a decade of ecological restoration, and now that's been declared from 2021 to 2030. I've also got this idea being connected with the monkey puzzle tree in Chile. There was one in my school grounds where I went to school for 6 years here in Scotland. And when I first traveled to South America in the 1970s, I found that's where the monkey puzzle tree comes from. A whole forest of them, a remarkable forest, a remnant from the time of the dinosaurs, highly threatened. And 5 years ago, I was called, I felt this inner prompting to go there, and I'm working on a book project about it now, because although many people love that tree, we don't really know much about where it comes from, and the forest is highly threatened because of climate change and human actions. So that's another thing that has emerged out of my connection with nature. How many more things are waiting to emerge from me, from others? So my message to everybody is really take your time to be in nature, to go deeply in your local area. Everybody can do it, wherever you are. Hug a tree, sit by a little pond or a little stream in your local area. Walk on the beach if you've got access to the coast. Take time to be still, to look and to connect, because that's what's missing in our world today, this personal connection with nature that has led to us creating this monstrous human culture that's out of control, that is destroying the planet. And it's time to kind of pause and change direction. And COVID-19 and the lockdowns are offering a tremendous opportunity for that. And I think a lot of people are taking time to explore their garden, to love their houseplants a bit more, to grow things. And that's one way I would encourage people. If you're in a situation where you can't get out into wild nature, have some houseplants in your living room that you look at and care for and nurture on a daily basis. I have a house full of plants here. I also grow some of my own food, and that's part of my connection with nature too. I've got vegetables in the garden, I've got tomatoes in my conservatory, and even in the middle of winter I'm growing bean sprouts on my kitchen windowsill. And growing my own food is part of my conscious connection with nature. So I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, Sharon. I suspect I'm probably getting close to the time. Let me look and see if there's anything on my notes that I haven't covered yet.
You're okay at the moment, Alan? You've got about 5 minutes left, or we can just go to Q&A. It's entirely up to you.
Okay, great. Yes, there's a couple of other things I just want to touch on. I made a few notes that I'm looking at here. This thing about connecting with nature, the famous American biologist Edward O. Wilson coined the term biophilia a few years ago, and he uses that to describe what he calls the innate human quality of love for nature. We are part of the web of life. That is our biological inheritance on this planet. And of course, most of us have lost it. It's part of that journey of rediscovery, of reclaiming my birthright that I described earlier on. So biophilia is really important. It's cultivating and nurturing that love for nature. And the planet desperately needs love at this time. Species need love at this time. Ecosystems need love. And many years ago, I had a very powerful experience. I went to Africa in 1988, amongst other things, to go and see the mountain gorillas. And like many people, I've been inspired by David Attenborough and his footage in one of his early television series of sitting there next to the mountain gorillas. So in 1988, I went to the Ruwenzori Mountains in what was then called Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and went up on this day trip to see the mountain gorillas. And I went up with a small group of people and with a local guide, and we found the gorillas. And as tourists, we weren't allowed to get too close to them, but our guide could. I got a picture of him sitting on the ground holding hands with this gorilla. And I had my camera set up on my tripod, and one of the gorillas came right up to me, and it started touching the camera and pulling the tripod leg. It was really curious. And my heart just opened completely to the gorillas. And we had an hour and a half there, and coming back down the mountain afterwards, I was just like singing with joy. My heart was so open and filled with this sense of deep love. These are some of our closest relatives, large, powerful animals, but very gentle, curious, and so obviously intelligent and interested in people. A couple of days later, in the lowland rainforest of further western Zaire, sitting in a little hut with loud African music blaring, I had this sudden insight because I had read an article, BBC Wildlife magazine, before going to this trip, and it is said that they documented this curious thing, that the gorilla groups that were habituated to people were having a higher birth rate somehow, and more babies were being born. And I suddenly had this inspiration that I had had this tremendous loving experience of heart open with the gorillas, and on some level that is nurturing their life force. All life benefits from love. I think many of us know somebody, maybe ourselves, maybe somebody we know, who's got a green thumb. This idea that if we really open our hearts and give love, our houseplants grow better, our roses never get insects or problems. It's actually a green heart, not a green thumb. And people who have pets, I think, experience the same thing. Pets flourish in an atmosphere of love, and any parent knows their children become more alive and more whole when they are nurtured and surrounded by love. And it's the same thing with nature. Nature needs our love at the moment, and I think there's a real role for humans to play in loving our planet back to life, opening our hearts and then giving of that through practical actions that care for the planet. Plant a tree, clean up a beach, protect an endangered species, support a conservation group. All of those things are an expression of love, and we need to develop this culture where we start to consciously give back to the planet more than we take. So I think that's probably a good note to end on for the moment. It's time for nature for all of us, and let's really turn the situation around in the world. We've each got the power to do that. Thanks for your attention, and we'll see if there's any questions.
There are some questions, Alan. Yeah, I think that was amazing. I like the story about the John Muir days and sort of going in the trees and hanging out there to see what it's like to be blown in the wind. I think we need to do that, actually. We've got a John Muir deliverer worked for us, Phil McCarry, and he just sent me a message actually to say, wouldn't it be cool to have a John Muir day where we can just hang out in the tree? I quite like that idea. I really do. In the safest possible way, of course. So one of the questions was about, you know, obviously, we are probably all listening to this webinar today. We're all of the same like-minded people that, you know, love nature and really embrace that. But if you're faced with someone who clearly doesn't get that message, and we get that quite a lot in our work with Climate Action North, about, you know, trying to convince people that it is a good thing to be involved in nature and taking action on climate change. What sort of advice, I suppose, have you got of addressing people who are so disconnected and clearly don't get that message? Or, I mean, it's quite a difficult job, isn't it, to do that?
It is, yes. I think there's a problem in trying to convince people. To me, what I've learned over the years is real change has to come from within. Otherwise, you know, if somebody's just trying to convince somebody else, it's imposing ideas, and, you know, we've had enough of that throughout human history. So in those sorts of situations, I would try to find, where is there some common ground, you know, because there will be common ground somewhere, and there may be an opportunity to find that. There's some area of shared interest, something those people feel passionate about, you know. It might be to do with food and, you know, the quality of food, or the air. You know, we all breathe the same air. And I think, you know, things like the COVID-19 lockdowns have really shown, you know, the difference in air quality when we change our lifestyles, because we've all had to reduce the impact of our lifestyles. And I think that sort of stuff is really getting out there and touching people more. So that's what I would do. I would always be trying to find an area of common ground. That's not always possible. So in my younger years, I was a campaigner, I was an activist, I was out there protesting and demonstrating, and I don't do much of that now. I rather try to make my life an example, a positive example of how I found my power to make a difference and to come fully alive, and that hopefully will be infectious. And by doing that, it's not just through my work, it's also through the way I live. So I became vegan 40 years ago because I discovered then, through travels to South America, I saw the rainforest being cut down to make cattle pasture for cheap beef. I don't want to be part of that. So it's kind of bringing my life into alignment with my values as much as possible. I live in an eco-village here in the north of Scotland. My house is heated by the sun, highly insulated. We've got a community wind farm. We've got a living machine that processes our sewage on site ecologically, all those sorts of things. I still have a car, but it's an electric car. So I've tried to bring as much of my life into alignment with care for nature as possible, hopefully so that that can inspire others to do the same. Because I'm nobody special. I'm no different to anybody else. We all have the power to make a meaningful difference in the world if we follow our hearts. So that's, to me, that is the way that real change comes about, rather than trying to convince somebody and getting into an argument. I think that's that can serve a purpose of raising an issue, but it's not going to find a positive way forward. It's going to create more conflict, more separation.
So a question about Trees for Life as well, Alan. You know, when you set up Trees for Life, obviously, what experience did you have of trees, I suppose, when you set up that very ambitious project, which is amazing, really, when you're following progress now? So what was your inspiration for that sort of, did you have any experience, really?
No, I had no practical experience at all. I'd never grown a tree in my life. I had no background. I gave up biology when I was 12 at school because I didn't want to learn to dissect frogs, which was on the agenda. So, but my real experience was a love of nature, was a love of trees, a love of being out in forests and wanting to care for it. And that propelled me, that drove me forward to talk to people. And when I made the commitment in 1986, it took 3 years before any practical action happened, because I had to educate myself, I had to make contact with landowners, I had to raise money. And I was very impatient, you know, at the time as a young man, wanted it all to happen now. And it was quite frustrating that 3 years went by before anything significant occurred. But actually, looking back now, I realized that I was still operating from a human perspective, and I needed to learn to think more from the perspective of a tree and a forest. And a Scots pine can live for hundreds of years. The oldest pine in Scotland is 550 years old. So a delay of 3 years is very little in comparison to the life of a tree. But for me at that time, it was a significant chunk of my life. So I started it with nothing on an external level, but I had this most important thing of this connection with nature. And if I look at a lot of people who've been influential, I think that's similar. You know, I think of somebody like Charles Darwin. You know, he changed the world in many ways with his formulation of the theory of evolution. And he was a young man on board this boat, the Beagle, and he went out and he just watched nature, he observed nature, and that was what inspired him. And many other people, I think, do the same thing. And I think there's a bit of a trap in our world today, thinking that before we can do anything, before we can really make a difference, we have to be fully educated and trained and qualified and have, you know, degrees and doctorates and all that sort of thing. I don't want to devalue that. There's an importance there, but much more important, I think, is to have the passion and the heart connection, because without that, there's no core to it. All those other things can be learned, can be studied, but if the heart connection is not there, there's a big gap in the center. So that's been my experience. And I think that's really important, because it's very empowering for anybody to know that we have all this ability to do things. We don't need to have a university degree and years of experience. What I say to people is, you know, now, if there were no limits in the world, if there were no obstacles, what would you do? Because that's exactly what you should do, because there are no limits or obstacles except for the illusory ones that we still haven't shaken off from our upbringing, that say, oh, I'm not good enough, or I've never done it before, or what would my parents think, or all those sorts of things. It's time to really get on and love nature and turn this world around.
That's brilliant. I mean, there's been lots of positive comments on the chat as well about the John Muir days and the gorillas and stuff. There's been lots of chat going on there as well. And also a question from Julie about, do you ever get involved with the youth groups? I'm assuming that the Trees for Life is still working. I mean, they've got the new rewilding centre, haven't they, that they're raising funds for, I believe. So does they get involved in youth groups? Do you get any sort of involvement with any other groups in your area, or?
Well, yes, there's a bit of a story there. Back in the 1990s, in the relatively early times of Trees for Life, there was a woman started volunteering with the charity, and she got totally enthused and passionate about it, and she set up the training program to train the leaders who run the conservation weeks. And then she said to me at a certain point, Alan, you know, it's great that we do this and we've adults come, but we've got to reach the new generation. We've got to reach young people. So she started, she had a friend who had a personal family trust and got a bit of money from them, started taking primary school children from Inverness out on day trips into the Caledonian forest, children who'd never been out in that landscape before. And it became very successful and it grew. She started enrolling more schools. And in 2003, that project was taken out of Trees for Life and set up as a separate charity called Wild Things, specifically focused on environmental education. And I've been a trustee of it since 2003, and I was the chair of that of the trustees for almost 20 years there. And I'm still involved with it today. And that now is an award-winning charity in its own right that is working with young people in particular, also with older people, but it does a lot of great work. So if anybody's interested, look up Wild Things in Scotland. They're a really good charity and changing a lot of young people's lives.
We will definitely be looking that up, because I hadn't realised that. So I've certainly made a note of that to sort of follow up on that conversation. That's really good. Is there anything you particularly want to raise awareness of as a call to action? You will get another opportunity at the end, of course, but we're just trying to remind people that it is Time for Nature Day today. And, you know, if there's anything we can do to help, it's about that kind of one small change, that if we could all do something differently or do something very simple to help, then, you know, what could we do to help you?
Yeah, well, I would say that I would pose the question to people, each day, what can you do that's positive for nature today? And, you know, it might be something as simple as picking up some rubbish when you're out for a walk. It might be as simple as hugging a tree. Or it might be telling a story to somebody, or it might be sending a donation to a charity. Trees for Life is running an appeal at the moment for montane woodland in the Upper Afric watershed. You know, the trees that grow at the tree line, dwarf birch and montane willows and so forth. A very worthy project. That's good to support. I have a particular interest in mangroves, and they're highly threatened at the moment around the world. There's a Mangrove Action Project that's focusing on that. So find a cause and give something, volunteer with them, but find something positive to do for nature every day, because that is what builds this relationship, that builds this connection, that restores our lost birthright. Give something back, because we receive so much from nature. All our food, our clean air, our water, our clothes, our energy from renewable sources, and we now need to become much more conscious about giving something back. And we can do that individually, personally, and we can do it collectively. And that's what we need to learn to do as a species now, if we want to survive on the planet, and if we want millions of other species and healthy ecosystems to survive as well.
Excellent. But we've just had another question, actually, if I can ask you that one, please. Julie said,
Okay.
have you met or worked with Jane Goodall at all?
I haven't worked with her. I did meet her once at an event. I've heard her speak a few times. She's one of those very inspiring people, quite quiet in some ways, but has touched millions around the world, been very effective, and who also very clearly has built her life based on a deep love for nature.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Yeah, that's brilliant, Alan. So I think if no one has any more questions, but if you do think of anything later for the audience, if you have any questions, just ping them through and we'll ask them. And I think we're going to break for coffee now. So we will pause the recording and go and have a cuppa. And if everyone could just come back to the screen at about 11:30, and we'll restart with Grace from IOSF. So thank you so much, Alan. It was excellent, really, really good. And if you can stick around until the end of the session, we'll have another chat with you. Thank you very much.